The ordinaire felt crisp as J.D. Vance stepped out of his black SUV in front of Middletown High School. Campaign signs dotted the lawn, and a small crowd of local officials waited at the entrance. He straightened his tie and put on his best smile, the one he perfected since becoming a senator. "Senator Vance, welcome back," called out the school principal, walking forward to shake his hand. "The students are so excited to meet you." J.D. nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. Being back here always brought a flood of memories. This was where he'd spent 4 turbulent years as a teenager, struggling through classes while his home life fell apart around him. Now he was returning as a success story, the kid from a troubled background who'd made it to the Marines, then Yale Law School, then the Senate. "We've prepared a tour before your speech," the principal continued, leading him through the front doors. "Some things have changed since you were a student here." The hallways were brighter than J.D. remembered. New lockers lined the walls, and motivational posters had replaced the outdated school announcements. But the squeaky fluorescent lights and the faint smell of floor cleaner were exactly the same. As they walked, J.D. half listened to the principal's chatter about test scores and recent renovations. A group of teachers joined them, eager to meet the famous alumnus. J.D. shook hands and made small talk, playing the part of the successful politician returning to his roots. "The auditorium is this way," the principal said, steering the group around a corner. "We've just installed a new sound system for your speech." That's when J.D. saw him, an elderly man slowly pushing a mop down the hallway ahead of them. He wore faded blue work pants and a gray shirt with the school logo. His white hair was thin, and his back was slightly stooped, but something about his methodical movements struck J.D. as familiar. The principal was still talking, pointing out features of the building, but J.D. had stopped listening entirely. He slowed his pace, falling behind the group as they approached the old janitor. "Excuse me," J.D. called out, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hallway. The old man turned, leaning on his mop handle. Deep wrinkles lined his face, but his eyes were clear and alert. He looked at J.D. with polite curiosity. "Mr. Jenkins?" J.D. asked, hardly believing his eyes. "Harold Jenkins." The janitor's expression shifted from confusion to recognition. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice rough with age, but still carrying the same gentle tone J.D. remembered. "Little J.D. Vance. Though I guess nobody calls you little anymore, Senator." J.D. laughed, genuine warmth replacing his practiced campaign smile. "It's been a long time, Mr. Jenkins." "Almost 20 years, the old man nodded. "You were just a skinny kid with too many thoughts in his head. Now look at you." The principal and the entourage had noticed J.D.'s absence and circled back. "Oh, I see you've met Mr. Jenkins," the principal said. "He's been with the school forever." "We know each other," J.D. explained, still looking at the old janitor. "Mr. Jenkins was here when I was a student." What J.D. didn't say was how much this man had meant to him back then. How Mr. Jenkins had found him hiding in empty classrooms during lunch, too ashamed to face the other kids. How the janitor had shared his own lunch with J.D. on days when there was no food at home. How he'd offered quiet words of encouragement when nobody else seemed to notice J.D. was drowning. "Shouldn't you be enjoying retirement by now, Mr. Jenkins?" J.D. asked, trying to keep his tone light. Something flickered across the old man's face, a brief shadow quickly hidden. "Oh, I keep busy," he said with a shrug. "These floors won't mop themselves." J.D. was about to respond when an aide tapped at his sleeve. "Senator, we're on a tight schedule. The press is waiting." J.D. nodded automatically but couldn't tear his eyes away from Mr. Jenkins. The janitor had to be at least 80 now. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, and his uniform looked like it had been patched multiple times. "I'll catch up with you after my speech," J.D. promised. Mr. Jenkins smiled and lifted his mop in a mock salute. "Don't worry about me, Senator. You've got important things to do." As J.D. walked away, following the principal toward the auditorium, he couldn't shake a sense of unease. The world saw him as a success story, the boy who had overcome his difficult upbringing to reach the heights of power. But seeing Mr. Jenkins still mopping these same floors after all these years made him wonder who the system was really working for. After seeing Mr. Jenkins still mopping the halls after all these years, J.D. Vance couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned in his hotel bed, the image of the old man's weathered hands gripping the mop handle playing over and over in his mind. Those were the same hands that had once helped a troubled teenager find his way. JD's mind drifted back to those difficult high school days. His home life had been a mess back then, the kind of chaos he would later write about in his famous book. Most days, he couldn't focus on his classes. The noise in his head was too loud, filled with worries about what he might find when he got home. He started spending lunch periods hiding in empty classrooms, sometimes just to catch his breath, other times trying to make sense of homework he hadn't been able to concentrate on the night before. That's when he first really noticed Mr. Jenkins. "You don't have to hide, son," Mr. Jenkins had said one day, surprising JD, who thought the room was empty. "But if you need a quiet place, I won't tell nobody you're here." At first, JD had just nodded, embarrassed at being caught. But over the weeks that followed, a pattern emerged. Mr. Jenkins would quietly clean around him, occasionally dropping a small piece of wisdom into the silence between them. "My daddy worked in the steel mills for 40 years, Mr. Jenkins told him one day while wiping down desks. Never missed a day, even when his back was so bad he could hardly stand straight. He taught me that there's honor in any job done well." Another time, he found JG staring blankly at math problems. Without making a big deal of it, Mr. Jenkins paused his work. "I ain't no mathematician, but my wife taught 3rd grade for 30 years. She always said if you break problems down small enough, anybody can solve them." He stayed an extra 10 minutes that day, helping JD work through the problems step by step. What stuck with JD most was how Mr. Jenkins carried himself. The man cleaned toilets and mopped up teenage messes, yet he walked the halls with his head high. He knew every student's name. Teachers respected him. He wasn't just the janitor, he was Mr. Jenkins, an essential part of the school. Now, lying in his hotel room, JD remembered a particularly bad day when he'd been hiding again, this time with red eyes he didn't want anyone to see. "World weighing on you today?" Mr. Jenkins had asked, leaning on his broom. JD had just shrugged, not trusting his voice. "Let me tell you something," Mr. Jenkins said, pulling up a chair. "Where I grew up, folks like to say some people are just born unlucky. But my grandma, smartest person I ever knew, she'd say, luck is just the place where preparation and opportunity meet up. What she meant was, you can't control what life throws at you, but you can control how ready you are when something good comes along." He'd tapped JD's textbook with a calloused finger. "This right here, this is your preparation. The rest will come." Those quiet moments had been lifelines for JD, small islands of calm and wisdom in the storm of his teenage years. Mr. Jenkins never preached or pushed. He just showed up, day after day, doing his job with pride and occasionally dropping the kind of simple, hard-earned wisdom that only comes from a life truly lived. Lying in bed now, as a grown man with power and influence, JD felt something shift inside him. The boy who had needed help had become a man who could offer it. The circle was waiting to be completed. He reached for his phone in the darkness and made a note, find out more about Jenkins' situation. He wouldn't rush in with assumptions or charity that might hurt the old man's pride. He would approach this the way Mr. Jenkins had approached him all those years ago, with respect and the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can offer someone isn't a handout, but a recognition of their dignity. As sleep finally came, JD felt a sense of purpose settling over him. Tomorrow, he would start asking the right questions. Tomorrow, he would begin to repay a debt that had been waiting nearly 20 years to be acknowledged. The morning after his encounter with Mr. Jenkins, JD made a phone call to his old high school principal, Mrs. Thompson. She'd been there for years and knew every staff member like family. "Senator Vance." "What a surprise," she answered, clearly pleased by the unexpected call. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. I'm actually calling about someone who works at the school, Mr. Jenkins, the janitor. I saw him yesterday and, well, I was surprised he's still working at his age." There was a pause on the line. "Harold's situation is complicated," she finally said, her voice lowering. "Between us, I've tried to get him to retire for the last 5 years, but he always refuses." JD listened carefully as Mrs. Thompson explained. Mr. Jenkins' wife, Helen, had been diagnosed with dementia about 7 years ago. At first, it was just forgetfulness, misplaced keys, repeated stories. But as the years passed, she needed more care, more medication, and more doctor visits. Their insurance helped, but it didn't cover everything. The extra costs had quickly eaten through their modest savings. "He won't take charity," Mrs. Thompson sighed. "I offered to organize something through the church, but he shut that down immediately. Said he's always provided for his family and wasn't about to stop now." Later that day, JD drove to the local diner where he'd heard Mr. Jenkins took his lunch break. Sure enough, there he was in the corner booth, eating a simple sandwich and reading yesterday's newspaper. "Mind if I join you?" JD asked, sliding into the seat across from him before he could object. Mr. Jenkins looked up, surprised but not displeased. "Free country, Senator." They talked casually at first, about the school, about old teachers who had come and gone. JD watched how the old man's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup, how his shoulders stooped forward with age and exhaustion. "Mr. Jenkins, I hope you don't mind me asking, but why are you still working? Most folks your age are enjoying retirement." The old man's eyes crinkled at the corners, not in humor, but in weary acceptance. "Retirement's for people who can afford it," he said simply. Bit by bit, the full picture emerged. Helen needed special medication that cost nearly $600 a month after insurance. Their small house needed repairs they couldn't afford to make. Their daughter, Lynn, lived 2 states away with her own family and struggles. She helped when she could, but it wasn't enough. "Helen doesn't always remember who I am anymore," Mr. Jenkins said quietly, looking down at his weathered hands. "But sometimes she has good days. She'll smile and call me my Harold just like she used to. Those moments, they're worth every blister and backache." Walking back to his car after lunch, JD made another call, this time to his old friend Tanya, who now worked in elder services for the county. "I need to understand all the options for someone in Mr. Jenkins' position," he told her. "Not just the obvious stuff, but everything: grants, programs, services, the works." The next few days became a crash course in the harsh realities facing many older Americans. JD spoke with healthcare advocates, retirement specialists, and community support organizations. The picture that emerged was bleak: too many elderly people falling through the cracks of a system that wasn't designed to handle their complex needs. He visited the Jenkins small home one evening, ostensibly to pay respects to his former school mentor, but really to see conditions firsthand. The house was immaculately clean, showed signs of deferred maintenance everywhere: water stains on the ceiling, drafty windows patched with plastic sheeting, an ancient furnace that groaned with effort. Helen Jenkins sat in a worn armchair, a handmade quilt across her lap. She smiled vaguely at JD, clearly not recognizing him or perhaps even understanding who he was. But the way Mr. Jenkins looked at her, with such tenderness and devotion after all these years, struck JD deeply. Driving away that night, he made a decision. This wasn't just about helping one elderly janitor. This was about addressing a problem that affected thousands of people who had worked hard their whole lives only to find themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. "This isn't right," he muttered to himself as streetlights flashed across his face. "And I'm in a position to actually do something about it." JD sat in his hotel room with papers spread across the bed, the desk, and even some taped to the wall. Yellow sticky notes covered everything. He'd been up most of the night, fueled by coffee and a growing sense that he'd stumbled onto something important. His phone rang. It was Paul, his chief of staff. "Boss, you've missed 2 meetings today. The committee chair called, and he's not happy." "I need another day here," JD replied, his eyes still scanning a document about Medicare coverage gaps. "This is personal." "It's about that janitor, isn't it?" Paul sighed. "Look, I get it. Write him a check, set up a GoFundMe, whatever you need to do. But we've got to be in Washington tomorrow." JD pinched the bridge of his nose. "It's bigger than that, Paul. Mr. Jenkins won't take a handout. He's worked his whole life. His identity, his self-respect, it's all tied to his ability to provide and be useful. I give him money, and I rob him of the very thing keeping him going." There was silence on the other end of the line. "You still there?" JD asked. "Yeah," Paul answered softly. "You just reminded me of my own grandfather. Worked as a mechanic until he was 78. Couldn't get him to stop." JD smiled. "So do you understand? I need to find a way to help that preserves his dignity." After hanging up, JD stared at his notes. The problem was clear. Mr. Jenkins needed money, but he also needed purpose. Simply handing him cash wouldn't work. The solution had to be more thoughtful. The next morning, JD met with the school superintendent, a practical woman named Mrs. Winters, who managed the district's tight budget with remarkable skill. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," she said after hearing him out, "but we barely have enough to keep the lights on. Creating some kind of special position isn't in our budget." JD leaned forward. What if the funding came from elsewhere? What if Mr. Jenkins could reduce his hours but still earn the same salary by taking on a different role? One that's less physically demanding but still vital. Her eyebrows raised. "I'm listening." By lunchtime, JD was meeting with Tom Rivera, an old college friend who'd gone into financial planning. They sat at a coffee shop while Tom reviewed Mr. Jenkins' situation. "The immediate problem is cash flow," Tom explained. "But the bigger issue is his wife's long-term care. Those costs are only going to increase." "So what are our options?" JD asked. Tom outlined several possibilities, none of them perfect. JD took notes, asking questions, pushing back on some points. A plan was beginning to take shape in his mind. Later that afternoon, he visited Mrs. Collins, who ran the community center. She'd known the Jenkins family for decades. "Helen used to teach knitting classes here before she got sick," Mrs. Collins recalled fondly. "Such a patient teacher." JD nodded, thinking. The center seems short-staffed. "Do you ever need help with maintenance or managing the building?" Mrs. Collins laughed. "Always. Our last handyman quit 2 months ago, and we can't afford to hire someone new." By evening, JD was back in his hotel room making more calls. He reached out to Dr. Patel, who specialized in elder care and had written papers on the psychology of retirement. He connected with Pat Johnson at the state's Department of Aging. He even called his own grandmother, who had faced similar challenges caring for his grandfather years ago. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. JD realized that Mr. Jenkins' situation wasn't unique. Thousands of elderly Americans were working well past retirement age, not just for money but for meaning. The system wasn't built for them. Around midnight, JD stood staring at his wall of notes. He'd been thinking too small. This wasn't just about helping one man, it was about creating a model that could help many. What if he could establish something that addressed both the financial and psychological aspects of aging with dignity? He grabbed a blank sheet of paper and wrote at the top, "Dignity in Retirement Foundation." Below it, he began outlining a multi-pronged approach: financial support that felt earned, not given; meaningful work opportunities tailored to skills and physical abilities; healthcare navigation assistance; home maintenance services. JD fell asleep in his chair just before dawn, the outline clutched in his hand. For the first time since seeing Mr. Jenkins mopping those hallways, he felt like he was on the right track. This wasn't charity. This was something new, something that recognized the full humanity of people who still had so much to give. 2 weeks later, JD walked into the small law office in downtown Middletown. The sign on the door read, "Wilson and Associates," and inside, 3 people waited around a conference table covered with legal documents. They stood when he entered. "Sorry I'm late," JD said, shaking hands with everyone. "Traffic was worse than I expected." "No problem, Senator," said Bill Wilson, the gray-haired lawyer who had helped many local families for decades. "We're just glad you're moving forward with this." JD took a seat and picked up a pen. "Let's make this official." With a few signatures, the Dignity in Retirement Foundation was born. JD had put in $250,000 of his own money to start it off, money from his book sales and speaking fees, not his Senate salary. He hadn't told anyone in his office except Paul, and he'd sworn him to secrecy. "No press releases, remember," JD reminded them as they wrapped up. "We need to prove this works before we start talking about it." The next day, JD met with Principal Thompson and Superintendent Winters at the school. Mr. Jenkins wasn't there. They'd carefully scheduled the meeting during his lunch break. "So we've created a new position," JD explained, showing them the paperwork. "Facilities consultant and maintenance trainer. 20 hours a week, same salary he's making now for 40 hours. The foundation covers the difference." Principal Thompson nodded approvingly. "And his duties?" "He'll train the new maintenance staff, document all the quirks of the building systems, create maintenance schedules, that sort of thing. Work that uses his knowledge but doesn't require him to be on his feet all day. And the healthcare supplement? Asked Superintendent Winters. JD slid another folder across the table. The Foundation will provide additional coverage for Mrs. Jenkins' care, but it's structured as a benefit of his new position, not charity. We've also arranged for home healthcare visits twice a week to give him some respite. 3 days later, JD sat nervously in Principal Thompson's office, waiting for Mr. Jenkins to arrive. He'd rehearsed what to say a dozen times, trying to find words that wouldn't hurt the older man's pride. When Mr. Jenkins walked in, he looked confused to see JD there. "Have a seat, Harold," Principal Thompson said warmly. "Senator Vance has something he'd like to discuss with you." Mr. Jenkins sat down slowly, his work-worn hands resting on his knees. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" he asked with a small smile that didn't hide his concern. "Just the opposite," JD replied. "The school is creating a new position, and you're the only person qualified to fill it." As JD outlined the role, he watched Mr. Jenkins' face carefully. The older man listened without expression at first, then his eyebrows drew together. "So I'd be teaching the new folks," he clarified, "showing them how to keep this old building running right." "Exactly," Principal Thompson confirmed. "Nobody knows this place like you do, Harold. We need that knowledge documented and passed on. And I'd still be working here, still be part of the school. You'd still have your locker, your keys, everything," JD assured him. "You'd just be working smarter, not harder." When they explained the improved health benefits that came with the position, Mr. Jenkins grew quiet. He looked down at his hands for a long moment. "This isn't charity," he finally asked, looking directly at JD. "Because I don't take handouts." "It's not charity," JD said firmly. "It's the school recognizing your value beyond just physical labor. Your experience and knowledge are worth more than your mop skills, Mr. Jenkins. They always have been." The older man nodded slowly, blinking a bit more rapidly than before. "Well then," he said, his voice slightly rough, "I suppose I can give it a try." That evening, JD made more calls, setting other parts of the Foundation's work in motion. He connected with 3 other elderly workers in similar situations across Ohio. Each case was different, but the principle remained the same: provide support that preserved dignity and purpose. A month later, Mr. Jenkins invited JD to dinner at his home. The house had new windows installed, and a ramp now led to the front door. Inside, Mrs. Jenkins sat in a new adjustable chair, looking more comfortable than before. The home healthcare worker had just left. "Helen had a good day today," Mr. Jenkins said quietly as they sat down to eat. "She remembered I got a promotion." He smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "That's what I told her. That after all these years, I finally got promoted." JD had hoped to keep the Foundation's work quiet for at least 6 months, but news travels fast in small towns. It started with whispers in the teacher's lounge about Mr. Jenkins' new role, then questions at the diner where the old janitor ate lunch. By the 3rd month, people had noticed the changes at the Jenkins house: the new windows, the ramp, the occasional healthcare worker's car parked out front. The story finally broke on a Tuesday morning. JD was in Washington when his phone rang. It was Paul. "Have you seen the Middletown Journal today?" Paul asked without greeting. JD's stomach tightened. "No, what happened?" "Front page. Local senator's secret mission to help elderly school janitor. They've got quotes from the school staff, pictures of Mr. Jenkins, the whole thing." JD closed his eyes. "How bad is it?" "Bad. Boss, people love it. The paper's website crashed from traffic. My phone's been ringing nonstop with calls from other news outlets wanting to verify the story." By that evening, the story had spread beyond the local paper. A regional TV station sent a reporter to interview Mr. Jenkins, who looked uncomfortable in front of the camera, but spoke with quiet pride about his new position. "I'm passing on what I know," he told the reporter, standing straighter than he had in years. "This building has its own personality. You can't just read a manual to understand it." When they asked about Senator Vance's involvement, Mr. Jenkins simply said, "He was a good kid who grew up to be a good man. Not much more to say than that." JD tried to stay in the background, declining interview requests and redirecting attention to the Foundation's mission rather than his personal connection to Mr. Jenkins. But 3 days later, as he walked into a committee meeting, an older senator stopped him in the hallway. "My brother-in-law is in the same boat," the man said quietly. 76 and still working as a groundskeeper at a golf course because his pension doesn't cover my sister's medical bills. He pressed a business card into JD's hand. "I'd like to help with your foundation." That conversation was the first of many. As the story spread, more people came forward, not just with praise, but with offers of help and stories of their own family members facing similar challenges. A week later, JD returned to Ohio for a previously scheduled town hall meeting. He expected the usual questions about taxes and foreign policy. Instead, the first person to the microphone was a woman in her 60s, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her hands slightly twisted with arthritis. "My husband worked at the paper mill for 42 years, she began, her voice steady despite the microphone's feedback. When it closed, his pension wasn't what they promised. He's 70 now and working as a night watchman because we can't make ends meet otherwise." She paused, gathering herself. "He's not looking for handouts either, but he's tired. We're all tired." The room fell silent. JD nodded slowly, acknowledging her words. "What you did for Mr. Jenkins," she continued, "could something like that help people like my husband?" Before JD could answer, another person stood up across the room. "My mother's in the same situation," he called out, 74 and still cleaning houses. Soon, others were standing, sharing similar stories. The town hall transformed into something JD hadn't expected, a community opening up about a struggle that many had been facing silently, each family thinking they were alone in their difficulties. Later that night, JD sat in his childhood friend's kitchen, going through a stack of papers, names, and contact information from people at the town hall who wanted to help or needed help themselves. "I think you've hit a nerve," his friend said, sliding a cup of coffee across the table. JD nodded. "I didn't realize how big this was. These aren't isolated cases. It's happening everywhere." The next morning, his phone rang again. It was a reporter from a national newspaper. "Senator Vance, we'd like to do a feature on your foundation. People are calling it a new approach to elder care and retirement dignity." JD hesitated, then made a decision. "I'll do the interview on one condition. It focuses on the issue, not on me. And I want Mr. Jenkins involved." This started with him, and his voice should be heard. 2 days later, JD sat beside Mr. Jenkins in the man's living room as the reporter asked questions. The photographer captured images of them looking through an old maintenance log that Mr. Jenkins had kept for decades. "The foundation isn't about charity," JD explained. "It's about recognizing that worth doesn't end at retirement age. We've got generations of knowledge and skill that we're just throwing away because we don't have systems that value them properly." 3 years had passed since that chance encounter in the high school hallway. JD stood at the back of the crowded community center, watching as Mr. Jenkins adjusted the microphone at the podium. The old janitor wore a simple blue suit that fit him better than the maintenance uniform ever had. At 83, he stood taller now, his shoulders no longer stooped from years of mopping floors. "Never thought I'd be giving speeches," Mr. Jenkins began with a small chuckle, looking out at the assembled crowd. "Spent most of my life trying not to be noticed, just doing my job quietly. Turns out being invisible isn't always the best way to help others." The audience laughed warmly. Many of them were beneficiaries of the Dignity in Retirement Foundation, former truck drivers now serving as driving instructors, retired nurses working as health coaches, ex-construction workers teaching home repair classes. Each one had a similar story: decades of hard work, inadequate retirement funds, and a fierce desire to maintain their independence and usefulness. "When Senator Vance came to me with his idea, I almost said no," Mr. Jenkins continued. "Pride is a funny thing. Can keep you going when times are tough, but it can also keep you from accepting the help you need." He paused, looking down at his notes. "My wife Helen passed last year, as some of you know, but her last 2 years were good ones. She got the care she needed. I got to spend time with her instead of just worrying about bills. That's something I can never repay." JD felt a lump form in his throat. He'd attended Helen's funeral, sitting quietly in the back of the church while Mr. Jenkins received condolences from dozens of community members. The foundation had covered the funeral costs, but in a way that respected the family's dignity. A benefit program for all foundation members, not a special handout. Today we're celebrating helping our 500th person, Mr. Jenkins announced. 500 folks just like me who still have something to give. Who just needed a bridge between the life they had and the life they've earned. The crowd applauded. JD looked around at the faces, not just the elderly program participants but younger community members too. Local business owners who'd created part-time positions, healthcare workers who volunteered their services, college students who helped with technology training. What had started as one man's attempt to help his former janitor had grown into something that crossed political lines. Conservative supporters praised its focus on work and self-reliance. Progressive supporters appreciated its acknowledgement of systemic gaps in elder care. Both sides found common ground in the simple idea that growing older shouldn't mean losing your sense of purpose or contribution. When the speeches ended, people gathered around tables laden with home-cooked food. JD found himself beside Mr. Jenkins at the punch bowl. Quite a crowd, JD observed. You're a natural public speaker. Mr. Jenkins shook his head with a smile. Just speaking from the heart, something I learned from you. They were interrupted by an elderly woman who wanted to thank Mr. Jenkins. As she walked away, JD noticed a young man approaching, one of the local high school teachers. Senator Vance, I wanted you to know we've started a new program at the school. We're having our seniors interview foundation members about their careers and life experiences. It's part history project, part career exploration. JD nodded approvingly. Getting wisdom from people who've actually lived it. Smart. The kids love it. They're learning things no textbook could teach them. Later, as the event wound down, JD helped move chairs back into storage. He found himself working alongside Mr. Jenkins, just as the older man had once helped him with his math homework all those years ago. You know what the best part of all this is? Mr. Jenkins said suddenly. It's not the money or the healthcare or even the new job. He stopped working and looked JD directly in the eye. It's that people see us now, really see us, not as problems to solve or burdens to bear, but as people with something still to offer. JD nodded, understanding completely. As they finished cleaning up, Mr. Jenkins looked around the empty room with satisfaction. You remember what I told you once? About luck being where preparation meets opportunity. I remember. Well, sometimes life gives you a chance to create opportunity for others. That's what you did here. The old janitor placed a hand briefly on JD's shoulder. Not a bad legacy for a troublemaker who used to hide in empty classrooms. JD laughed. I learned from the best. They walked out together into the evening light. Two men from different generations who had each, in their own way, discovered that true dignity comes not from status or wealth, but from how we recognize and honor the humanity in one another.